Okay, great. So it was really exciting to see that all of you have been brainstorming about a number of topics last night. And so you passed on also a couple of questions, and I do have some of your questions here, but I suggest we don't stay with those questions. You're free to actually give your own questions as they are answering, responding to them. And if we don't cover all of them, that's fine to me. Let's just be very flexible about it. I actually broke them down a little bit in terms of more conceptual ones. Theoretical questions would be one category. Then you have more, let's say, applied questions. A third would be more methodological in nature, and the last would be more about the community and how we can actually build SDT as a community in the future as all of us together here. So just to open up, I'll read aloud, I think, one of the questions, which is maybe a more challenging one and relates also to the work I think we heard this morning by Ken Sheldon. And a recurring question here in one of the groups, which was on the bright and dark side of human nature, one of the brainstorm groups was the following one. So they wondered to what extent SDT is actually capable of explaining the dark manifestations of human nature. And so is a history of need, frustration, an adequate and sufficient explanation? Has SDT paid sufficient attention to unconscious aspects of human nature? They may possibly also influence our current thinking, our current acting, our current feeling, and our behavior. So that's, I think, a fairly broad question, but I thought, like, okay, we could start with this one.
Well, if it's a challenging question, I think Ed should take this then. If it's got only one part, I'll take it. So this is a challenging question, and I think it's an important question. Have we sufficiently addressed the dark side of human nature? And I think we've been grappling increasingly with this question. If those of you, all three of you who've read the book that Ed and I wrote recently, we've grappled with this question quite a bit at the end of the book. And basically, if I were to give an overview of our thinking on this, we think human nature is neither good nor bad. It has both capacities in it. We have evolved to have capacities to be defensive, to protect ourselves, to enter into competitive relationships with other people. That's just part of our evolved nature. It's also our evolved nature to be cooperative, altruistic, and kind to others. And so what our argument has been is that people's likely trajectory along the bright or dark sides of human nature has a lot to do with the experience-dependent nature of human development. So if you are in circumstances that are need-thwarting, threatening, depriving, insecurity focused, then you're much more likely to be focused on the competitive dark side aspects of behavior. And I think there's really good evidence for this. And we can see this evidence both at a societal level, and we can also see it at a proximal level. So in societies where there's a lot of discrepancy in wealth and threat and inequality and insecurity, we see a lot more manifestations of the dark side of human nature. But under nurturing conditions, we see much brighter sides of human nature, lower crime, more altruism, more community spirit. And then we see it at a more proximal level. We see out of families where there's been more mistreatment, malevolence, maltreatment, severe need frustrations. We see a lot more later aggression and negative outputs. But people who grow up in nurturing conditions turn out to be more pro-social, more altruistic, and derive great satisfactions from that. So there's not one human nature. There's human natures moving in different directions, and it has to do with what kind of environments we provide our youth and our cultures and our people.
If I can stay to this question a little bit longer, so one aspect maybe is to what extent do we need to focus more on unconscious elements and in our functioning, and would moving in that direction help us to even better cover indeed the dark sides? Or because we now have our measures of need frustration is often self-reported, but if we move in more in that direction, is that a critical direction for the future?
Well, I'm a little bit suspicious about the way in which the word unconscious might be being used. We've heard a lot of different uses of terms surrounding the idea of unconscious, sometimes the idea of implicit self or unconscious, so I would like to be more exacting about the way that we talk about it if we do pursue these things in SDT. I don't think that there's some I mean, we might, I don't know what your opinion is on this, but I don't think that there's some implicit or unconscious true self that we go to access. No. My belief about how the self operates is that we are always trying to become more aware and more coherent in what we do. And sometimes that means we've, in order to maintain that coherence, we may have compartmentalized or pushed out things that are very difficult for us to assimilate. And so when I think about the psyche, I think about those things we've been able to assimilate and those things we either haven't assimilated or are unwilling to assimilate. And I think that's a different way of thinking about this problem. I think that to always try and be conscious and always try and be aware of what our determinants are is the direction that human synthesis goes.
It's also the case that in terms of the sort of non-conscious, I heard a question yesterday in one of the meetings about, well, is that the same, or I mean, is it related to the implicit and explicit? Are they related in any kinds of ways? And I'm remembering a study, though I don't know who did it, I think it was in the Rochester labs, where when people were more mindful, there was greater connection between the implicit and explicit. And that's in line with what Rich was just saying about how autonomy and mindfulness, awareness, and so on facilitate the process of the so-called non-conscious or implicit processes.
Anybody in the audience who wants to add something or has a reflection or a follow-up question? People will be going around with the microphones, so Andrew?
Hi, I would just add that we should be mindful of the fact that the broader field hasn't worked out what is implicit, explicit, automatic, deliberative, and in SDT, we don't want to have to do that work for them.
I agree.
Because things haven't been defined, operationalized, or tested, and it might be a bit of a methodological cul-de-sac.
If I can elaborate on that, sometimes when people use the term implicit, they really mean projective narrative stories. Sometimes when they use the word implicit, they mean a reaction time test like an IAT. Sometimes when they use the word implicit, they mean unconscious. And I think we need to be much more exacting when we think about our models of what's within the span of integration of humans. So I totally agree with that.
Somebody at the side there. I propose that if you ask a question, you just say, okay, your name and maybe from where you come. That's kind of informative.
Thank you. Hi, Susan Fowler. When you're talking about how our environment can take us down the dark side or the bright side, can you just speak a little bit about the internalization process and what we know? Like, why is it some people in those circumstances go to the light side and some go to the dark side? What is that internalization process that determines which way we go, regardless of the conditions that we find ourselves in?
Well, the internalization model that we have in SDT is really just an aspect of the overall assumption that people are always moving in the direction of integration. And internalization is a description of that integrative process with respect to things that are not originally intrinsically motivated. And I think what the data has shown over many years is that when we have conditions that are supportive of basic psychological needs, people are more apt to truly and fully internalize some social behavior, but only if that behavior is consistent with other basic psychological needs within inside the person and other values that they have. So not everything is capable of being fully internalized. So we might have some rules or laws or ideas in a society that we want people to internalize, but they may be incompatible with people's internal sentiments. So there are two things that would feed into whether something gets fully internalized. Are there the right socializing conditions for it? In other words, is there support for basic psychological needs? And the second thing, what's the content of the internalization? And some contents of internalization can never be integrated because they're just incompatible with our nature. And I'll just use a simple example. Suppose I tried to raise boys in my family with the idea that boys never cry. Okay, the best that could happen with that is it could be interjected. It could never be fully integrated because it's not compatible with the emotional nature of human beings. But there are things that we could fully internalize because they are consistent with our nature. So I don't know, Susan, if that answers your question at all, but what I would say is that we can't fully internalize something that's going to be likely aggressive, violent, or nasty to other people, but we can interject that, or we can compartmentalize it.
So maybe I used the wrong term with internalization then. So maybe what I'm asking is if people have, like I know organizations, for example, where psychological needs, there's pockets where those psychological needs are present, and people still don't respond to those, to that positive environment. They still find a way to
well,
I don't know how to ask that question.
I can't speak to those pockets, but if I thought that there was a place in an organization where people were not responding to basic psychological needs, I think there's still something going on there I haven't figured out yet, that there's still something to be diagnosed that's in the way. And maybe that hasn't been voiced yet. So I can only assume that there's some other issue in those pockets where there's a frustration of some sort that hasn't been articulated.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Well, one of the things I think that is maybe kind of related here is how come also that for some people it's maybe easier to move in that direction of increasing integration, while for others they move towards, for instance, defiance. And they go against what is requested from the environment altogether. And so to what extent are also individual differences here important to be taken into account in interaction with the social environment that is either thwarting or supportive? So are we paying sufficient attention to those individual differences?
That's what I was trying to say.
That's actually what I figured, but I thought I want... I'm not going to rephrase it immediately. Because I think that's maybe a pressing question. If you talk about the dark side, so for some people it shows up in more externalizing problems. For others, it's more of the internalizing sort. And so how can we study this more?
Well, I mean, Maarten, when you start the question with, have we done enough on any topic, I would say the answer to that is no. We haven't done enough on any topic. So have we done enough on individual differences? The answer is no to that. Do we have a way to do that? I think the answer to that is yes. We have a way into that. We can, of course, do more studies on that. This is not just a problem for SDT. The whole issue of the multiple routes to various ends in psychopathology has been a big issue in the field more generally. Right. Like what leads somebody to be restrictive anorexic versus another one to be bulimic, and what are the things behind that? So those are difficult questions that I think we can study deeply, and we have a framework that can handle those questions.
And there is a chapter in the new book that really addresses that.
I guess he's saying, read that chapter now.
I thought we would hear it here so we wouldn't need to read the chapter. Huh? Next question. Anybody who has another question here? I do have a number of them, but I'll let it also open to the audience here.
Hey, Kirk Brown. And my question is about the origin of basic psychological needs. So we know that they are innate, that they are evolutionarily bound. So does that imply that we could find some genetic markers for the basic psychological needs, as well as the impetus towards satisfaction of those needs? And if so, would that be a useful inquiry to be making?
Well, I think it would be well, first of all, the origins of the basic psychological needs, first of all, they are not, their origins really are theoretical origins, I'd have to say. When we were originally thinking about these three basic psychological needs, we were thinking about the model of what a living thing is and what it requires. So living things are things that move in the direction of increased differentiation and integration, which we think is described by the nutriments of autonomy and competence. And in a social organism, they're moving in the direction of integration within their social community, which is part of the relatedness issue. So conceptually, the three needs derive from the very idea of a healthy living organism. But then they also derive, these three needs also derive deductively, or I should say inductively, from work we were doing on the manifestations of a thriving organism. So it was really because we saw the conditions under which people were really intrinsically motivated required that they felt autonomy and competence. We saw how important those were to that manifestation of living, thriving organisms. And we saw the importance of all three needs to internalization. So those things helped us inductively come to the same conclusion. So we've triangulated in on those three needs, both from the theoretical deduction from organismic theory and from the inductive work that's been done on experiments in intrinsic motivation, internalization, and well-being. So that's how we got to those three, and have never also foreclosed the question of whether there could be further ones. In terms of genetic markers, I think we may find that there are, particularly we're going to see that there's some different gene expressions that happen when there has been support or frustrations to those needs. And I think that kind of genetic work is really essential to understanding the outcomes of those things. We haven't done any really work within SDT so far on genetic markers, and I think it's obviously something we should move toward.
In the back there.
Thanks. Edo Meyer is my name. I have a question which I maybe have missed here, so sorry if that's not a new one. But how about the compensation? Is it possible to compensate certain basic needs in terms of life domains? For example, private domain, work domain. So it would be thinkable that somebody who has who fulfills his basic need in work doesn't need to fulfill it that much in his private life. And the studies that there have been already are quite inconclusive in that direction. So that would be very interesting.
Well, first of all, I think there has been evidence on compensatory frameworks so that people do try and satisfy needs that are frustrated in some domains of life, in other domains of life, sometimes in healthy ways and sometimes in unhealthy ways. And I guess, one good example of this comes from the work in video games that has been done, where we see that the people who have the dramatic pull to overuse video games, because video games are so good at satisfying basic psychological needs in an intense, immediate, dense way, that somebody who's not getting their needs satisfied in other areas of life has a real pull then toward these games that can satisfy them. And they may be the overusers of video games in time because of the need deprivation in other parts of life. And I think, many of us have different compensations where, if our work life is pretty unsatisfying, we're trying to compensate for that in other areas of life. So I think compensation goes on all the time. I think there's also evidence out there that if you have domains of life where you're not getting your needs satisfied, just getting them satisfied someplace else isn't enough. Imbalance in needs satisfaction seems to be itself a harm. I think there's been pretty good evidence on that. And of course, our fundamental and universal claim is that any place they're not being satisfied, there's a cost to well-being where that occurs. So you can't just make up for it in some other place. It still will pay a cost for you. And I think we would predict that we'll always be able to detect that cost.
What I would find interesting in this case is also on the moment, for instance, at work, your needs get completely frustrated. Your energy level will probably go down. You're less psychologically available, for instance, to interact with your partner or with your children at home. But so I would expect on average, if the needs get frustrated at work, likely you also pay a price for that in terms of need satisfactions at home. But still, there might be important moderators here for some people who can actually have the capacity to overcome the need frustrations so that the children at home and your partner are not suffering from your need frustrations you had earlier that day. So I think in terms of looking at moderators there, that's maybe also an interesting avenue for the future. I do have here another question which has to do with, I think a number of people in several groups asked this question, so about the different manifestations of autonomy support and need satisfaction. And just to give you an example is, okay, maybe there are some age-specific manifestations of what autonomy support means in interaction with toddlers, in interaction with children in primary school, in secondary school, but also you have persons with special needs that may also require other ways of supporting their autonomy, or in special contexts, for instance, in more challenging contexts, disciplinary contexts, or contexts where children need to learn something. So to what extent are all of these issues impacting on the variation in the manifestation of autonomy support? Could you comment upon this idea or share some reflections?
Well, I'm just going to begin by saying a little bit of a narrative about how I got into this field of motivation in the first place. And a long time ago, after graduating from college, I got into my first job, which was in working with people with severe developmental disabilities. And when I was working in that area, I saw that the way in which people with severe developmental disabilities were treated and motivated was inhuman. They were pushed around with behavioral regimens and with external control in a way that was really dispiriting and crushing to those people. And I thought there's got to be a better understanding of human motivation for this. And I start with this example because it doesn't matter which individuals, what human individuals we're looking at, they all have basic psychological needs, the frustration of which causes them harm. Now, what's the expression of autonomy in some of the people who were severely developmentally disabled that I worked with? It might not have been the same kinds of choices or interests or pursuits that I would have, but they had their own. They had their own interests, their own pursuits, their own things that they wanted to actualize and express. And it might have been maybe a simpler set of tasks than I would be working on, or a different set of wonderings, but there were wonderings and tasks and impulses and interests nonetheless. Every child from early on has things that they're reaching out for their mobile, and we want to make sure that we're responsive to that reach. When they get a little bit older, they're trying to figure out how the social world works. When they get into school, they want to figure out how to negotiate friends and home. So the problems in development change all the time. But one thing that doesn't change is the need to satisfy those basic psychological needs and to be responsive to them in ways that support autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So you're right, the manifestations differ. This is also a cultural issue, the way in which issues get manifest across different cultures. But we can still find the same general themes within each of these things. And if we don't attend to those needs, people don't thrive.
Somebody who wants to follow up on this, that maybe there was an issue that you discussed in your brainstorm group? Well, maybe related to this is one reflection I have here is, well, some people have indeed been proposing new candidate needs like beneficence and novelty and so on. And so one thought I have is maybe we could also start to think about the needs as, let's say you have a more general concept of needs, and then it's broken down into facets in one way or another. And so maybe beneficence in this specific case could be either a separate need, but it could also be maybe a part of relatedness, where it's more the reciprocal nature which speaks to this. Another aspect of relatedness could be, for instance, the dyadic interactions, and then you have the group dynamics. And so rather than having, let's say, a broader notion, you start to break it down, but you keep in the service of a parsimonious framework, you keep those three needs there. And we start to refine them. So I don't know what your thoughts would be around this.
I think we've done that informally. I mean, when we talk about it and what does relatedness really mean, and does the giving, is that really part of it, and various other things. So to get more formal and specific about it with some empirical work to help that process, I think would be a very interesting thing to do.
I'll just add to that. I agree we can have more facets to the needs that we have, but I'd also want to make sure that we understand everything cannot be explained by these three basic needs, that there are other things that enhance happiness, for instance, that aren't basic needs. There are other things that make us sad that are not related to the frustration of those needs. So I don't think we should try and force everything into this camp. There are enhancements that are not basic needs, but there are things that would make us, thrive more to have. So.
Anybody else in the back there?
Yeah, I have the mic. So, my question is to do with the ecological crisis, climate crisis, which has been notable by its absence in this conference. And so my question to you is, what more has STD got to offer to this?
Which crisis was that?
Ecological crisis, climate crisis.
Oh, climate crisis, yeah. Okay, thanks.
And so beyond just the kind of the application of theory, I'm aware of the research that's been done already around largely drawing about goals, motivation, also vitality. My own work is in that area. But for me, in the work which I've done, I think, for example, relatedness is also, there's also a need for relatedness with the non-human world. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts about what SDT has got to say to ecological crisis and contributing to how we address it.
First of all, as you raise the fact that there hasn't been much at this conference that's addressed the ecological crisis, I resonate with your point. I mean, I think all of us in this room know that we probably have very few years. We have a small number of decades left, and if we don't solve the ecological problems that we're facing, it's going to affect not only all of us, but all of our grandchildren, all of our children. So it's probably the most important thing we could be thinking about or dealing with, and we haven't got a lot here that has really been addressing it directly. There are some strands in research in SDT that I think are really important to this, and you mentioned one of them, which is in goal content theory. I think we've identified that the materialism and the consumerism that is so rampant within our societies is something that, although it can be addictive, it doesn't really satisfy our basic psychological needs and doesn't bring us the happiness that it promises, and that it's largely a compensatory set of motives that make up for need frustrations in other areas of life. And I think demonstrating that is at least helpful in making the argument against consumerism. But you raised a larger point, which is about can we be caring for more than just ourselves and our proximal relationships and our communities in the direct sense? Can we also care about the earth and the natural things that are on it, and start to identify with a larger sphere of influence? And since Emma Bradshaw was just up here, this was the topic of her dissertation, what we're calling the integrative span. And so we argue that people differ in terms of their integrative span. Some people really focus narrowly on their own self-interests, some more concerned about kin and relationships, some more concerned about community, but some people are also really concerned about a much larger sphere of all the living things that are on the earth and the future generations that will occupy this place. So we're trying to figure out now, what does it take to have that increased integrative span, and does it have a cost or benefit? And at least so far in Emma's research, what she's been able to show is that people who have a larger integrative span tend to be happier and healthier people. But there are burdens that come with that great integrative span too, because you're also now concerned with and shouldering the problems of the whole. So I think this is an area that we need to do a lot more research on, and we're just beginning down this road. I hope it helps to begin to answer some of these questions.
Anybody else? In the end, in the back there.
Hi, I'm Nikos Doumanis. Just
no.
You're still here?
Yes. I just have a question, just following on from what Rich said earlier, that you can't really be autonomously motivated to harm others. Is that right? Is that what you said, Rich? Yeah.
Yes.
So if this is the position, the theoretical proposition, I was wondering whether we need to take a look at the measures we use to measure autonomous motivation, because if I'm a narcissist, I'll enjoy actually manipulate others, and I'll actually see a lot of personal benefits and values in doing and engaging in behaviors that will benefit me and harm others. So do we need to change the way we measure some of these constraints to align more with what you said earlier?
Well, first, Nikos, when we use the term narcissism, we can talk about whether we mean kind of normal narcissism or self-esteem, or we really mean clinical narcissism. And truthfully, since I've met a lot of clinical narcissists besides the ones that are on stage here, One thing you don't get from the phenomenology that comes from them is that they're feeling really autonomous in their lives. They often feel pushed around, put upon by pressures. They feel those social pressures. They feel those social comparisons. They're pushed around by their own self-esteem needs. And this comes out in the phenomenological report. So I wouldn't say that they're characterized by a high degree of autonomy. I would say the opposite of that is that they're actually characterized by a high degree of heteronomy in actual clinical presentation. I don't know if you've seen evidence where they've actually endorsed on our questionnaires that they feel more autonomous than others, but if that's the case, then we need to do some work on the questionnaires. But that's not what comes across in clinical interviews with, I think, true narcissistic personalities. In fact, I think they're often pretty conflicted.
Well, maybe this brings us also to the issue here, what kind of methods we can be using. It's like a follow-up here, because I think you point towards self-reports, and then we have clinical observations. And one question that came out here is, okay, the importance of also qualitative work, and that it's maybe not sufficiently, we're not doing sufficiently qualitative studies which could possibly help to enrich the meaning of certain concepts and how people manifest themselves to others, may help to refine certain notions we have. So I think in that group, that brainstorm group, they kind of emphasize the importance of the qualitative work.
Yeah, I think that's true, but also neuroscience has got an important part to play in that whole process of going deeper.
Right, as another method. Right.
Exactly.
Right.
One of the things I've seen at this conference, listening to some of the qualitative research that's here, is how important it is in helping us fill in practically what often comes across as quite abstract in our research models. We can look at a structural equation modeling and show that X predicts Y and Z, but unpacking what the X is and understanding it in a really deep way so that we can then bring it back to practice it really requires, I think, complementary qualitative research. And so I think we need both of those things, but to be used in a convergent way. It's not one without the other. It's not qualitative research versus quantitative research. It's quantitative research and qualitative research to fill it in.
Well, in that respect, we are editing a special issue in motivation and emotion, and one of the pieces that will come out is one on different need supportive practices in the work domain. So, and this is qualitative work where they try to actually enrich the way how we have been thinking about what autonomy support means from your managerial role. And I think indeed it's a kind of cross-fertilization, or it could be complementary. Then you move back to developing new measures that speak to those issues that come out indeed based on your qualitative work. There was a question here. Go ahead.
Vanessa King. I'm relatively new to the deep world of SDT, but I have a question around meaning in life. And the role that plays in
too.
SDT. What? I'm still looking. Is it an outcome, or does it? If you look at Steiger's kind of definition, where he has particularly around coherence, about my life makes sense to me, bits of my life fit together, is that part of identification? I don't know. I'm just interested in your.
Well, so we just did a study with Steiger, who has this definition of meaning. Frank Martella and I did a study with Michael on just this question, and we used his meaning as a DV, basically showing that instances in your life where you felt like something was meaningful is typically predicted by an experience that's characterized by autonomy, competence, relatedness, and also for us, beneficence. Because many of the meaningful things we do are because we've been benevolent or kind to someone else, and that has special poignancy and meaning for us. So we use those as predictors of meaning, which we think to be an outcome, typically, of the satisfaction of basic psychological needs, rather than a need in its own right. And there are other reasons why we don't put it as a need in its own right, in part because of the openness of meaning and the contentless of what people call meaning. But if we use Steiger's definition of it, then it's clearly predicted by the satisfaction of the other basic psychological needs. And, since Frank's probably still in the room, and benevolence.
Can I just add a quick question following up on another one? You said that not everything can be explained by basic needs. What isn't explained by basic needs?
Well, that was hypothetical. No, I mean, an instance of this would be, let's say that, having vacations turns out to be a really important thing because it also revitalizes you, and we haven't looked into that very much. Part of that revitalization might be because you're autonomous while you're on vacation, or you connect with friends while you're on vacation. So that might partially explain it, but maybe it's just, getting some new stimulation or something, and that might enhance well-being, even though that turns out to not meet other criteria of basic psychological needs. So we may find that there are some things that enhance wellness on the one hand, and then we might find on the deficit side of things that there are things, if you don't have them, you can't possibly not be unhappy, but having them isn't enough to thrive. So what I think we will see is that there are some deficit needs that fulfilling them will at least help you stave off ill-being, but won't give you well-being. There's some enhancement needs that getting them will make you happier, but not getting them doesn't make you ill. But basic psychological needs, they work on both sides of that ledger, so that if you get a basic psychological needs satisfied, you increase in thriving, and if you get it deprived, you start to show more ill-being and degradation, and that's what makes them truly basic psychological needs.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much.
Anybody else?
Down here in the... Oh.
Hello, I'm Nasser Mohammed Hussain. I wonder what is your idea about punishment? If somebody commits a crime, he or she gets punished, comes into prison. If the crime is even worse, the time in the prison increases. But that is in a controlling environment. Mm-hmm. So maybe the basic psychological needs are not that much satisfied. So it has SDT a different perspective on punishment and in being in prison.
Well, when we think about punishment in the past was thought about as a motivating technique. And it's a motivating technique that should get you to decrease the frequency of a particular behavior that we would like you to decrease in. But I think one of the things that we know, and then you bring it to the issue of crime and prisons, one of the things that we've seen a lot is punishment isn't a very effective way of getting people to reduce the amount of crime that they'll commit. In fact, if a prison is simply oriented toward punishment, the chances are that the person, when released, is more likely to commit crime than if they were in a more needs-satisfying rehabilitation program that's in the middle of it. Punishment's just not a very effective way of creating maintained behavior change over time. And I don't think we were even disagreeing with behaviorists here. Behaviorists have realized that punishment's a pretty narrow way. Even when it works in a very narrow way, and it doesn't transfer or generalize very much. So I don't think punishment fits very well within an SDT model of how you'd want to produce behavior change at all. But it doesn't even work for those people who think it works. It seems more like an emotional response that society has to try and get that sense of fairness and justice. But if our mission was to stop people from committing crimes and to come out and live a more productive life, this would not be the way to do it. And when we talk about prisons are really, many prisons around the world are really need-depriving atmospheres, and people come out more damaged as a result of it. They go into prison and they get their autonomy taken away from them, they get their dignity taken away from them, and their relatedness taken away from them, and their opportunities for competence taken away from them, and that does not make them better citizens when then they're later released, because they're not any further prepared to interact with our societies around us. Tim Kasser, when he was with us at Rochester, did a study in one of our upstate prisons, and what he found is that the only thing that you could actualize in prison was basically to build your body, because they had gymnasiums, which means you could come out and be an even tougher criminal. But in terms of getting other needs satisfied in prison, there wasn't routes or pathways that were being provided to people. On the other hand, when your studies in prison, I think, showed that when prison guards and prison personnel are trained to be more autonomy supportive in their interactions with prisoners, prisoners are more likely to internalize the rules of prison, to have a better life in prison themselves, and I suspect that they'll be better citizens when they're released. So if I were thinking about how to handle people who've been in trouble with the law, it would be to put them into a program that's truly rehabilitative. It's truly trying to help them find the pathways to thrive, not trying to pull off some kind of retributive justice that doesn't work at all. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it did allow me to go on a riff about prisons. So.
Well, maybe adding to this, in this particular study, we also looked at the degree of choice that was experienced by prisoners. And so maybe the situation in the United States is different from Belgium, but for instance, prisoners can choose what kind of work they would be doing. There could also be more meaningful work, when they would be taking showers, how much time they would spend with people who are visiting them. And the experience of choice actually contributed to their autonomy within prison, which then predicted greater well-being. So even within this very constrained circumstances, I think there are still some variations here in the degree of choice being built in to the system, which is maybe indeed critical for them then to later reintegrate into society. I think maybe a broader issue that comes out, and I don't know whether that's also your question, is what's the functional significance of a punishment? And in general, it will be a very controlling one, but it also reminds me of the work of Geneviève Magot, who talks about, indeed, malpunishments and logical consequences. And I don't know whether, Geneviève, what's your opinion here? Do you feel comfortable responding to the question here?
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I think when we think about punishment, the idea of punishment in itself is kind of, it goes against the basic relationship that we're trying to create with people. I'm more, I study parenting mostly, not prisoners. So I would have to think about crime a little bit more. But I think when we think about SDT, sometimes people get uncomfortable because they think, well, I need to be able to stop a problem from occurring again. And I think when we focus on punishment, people think that's a way to solve that problem or to stop that problem from occurring. And as you said, it's not something that typically works. And I think we can look at it in a different way and take the SDT approach and look at a problem in a problem-solving way and to remain empathic. If we think about autonomy support, to me, it's to be more empathic, more informational, and to try to include the person in problem-solving. And I think when we approach a problem with that problem-solving attitude, we can remain empathic. We can provide information so the person can stop that problematic behavior, and we can encourage them to help problem solve with us. And if that doesn't work because we haven't created a good relationship with the person, I think the first element is to create the relationship with the child. So when we teach parents how to behave with their children or how to parent, we start by saying, we know you want to address problematic behavior, and we will address it, but it's in chapter 3. First, you need to build a cooperative relationship with the child, because nothing we can teach you will work if we don't have an empathy with the child, a relationship with the child. And so the first thing is empathy, how you listen. So the most difficult skill is to stop talking. And that's what we teach parents. And after, you can adopt a problem-solving attitude when there's a problem, because there's this trust and there's this cooperative attitude. So we can address the problem by saying, we have this problem, what can we do to address it? And if the child is unregulated and cannot listen to you, and you have explained why something is important, then I believe that it's the responsibility of the authority figure, and Mireille believes that too, but I believe that it's the responsibility of the authority figure to make sure that the person is safe and other people around in the family the problem is solved and that it doesn't perpetuate. So I guess that's what I mean.
Anybody who wants to follow up on this or has another question?
Well, I just want to follow up in one way. One of the problems with punishment as a strategy for dealing with behavior that we don't want to see recur is it doesn't diagnose why it came about in the first place. And I think it builds on what Genevieve was just saying, which is if somebody's done something that has transgressed a rule, I think the first thing is we want to know, like, why? Right. What went on that led them to do that? Because if we're going to solve that problem and get that not to happen again, that's a part of how we're going to solve it, is by diagnosing it. And punishment, whipping out the punishment doesn't let us know any of that. So, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Ola from Norway. We talked about prisons, and Csikszentmihalyi, who has researched flow, has also done a lot of studies on people in prison that are in deprived environments. And one of his findings was that not everyone who were in deprived environments came out broken. You also had some people that came out and they were acting as if they hadn't been in prison. And what the difference was that those people had, even though they were deprived, they found some ways to act autonomous and with competence. They would use a bar of soap, for example, rub it on their shoe sole, and then use a toothpick to write poems. Or they would do translation and they would work with other prisoners, for example. So it would seem that they found some ways to fulfill their needs, even though they were in a deprived environment. And that brings me to my question. So we've talked a lot about how you create environments that are autonomous, supportive, etc. But it seems that some people are good at fulfilling these needs on their own when they are in deprived environments. So do you think we could teach people to fulfill the needs themselves rather than putting the emphasis on always creating that environment for them? Thank you.
The epilogue of the last book that Rich and I just did really was essentially...
Sounds as if you were going to write another few books, but...
Well, yeah. About self-determination has to do with self. And a lot of the book is about the environment that supports it. But ultimately, it's up to you. It is up to you to make happen for yourself. And that's the...
So just building on that fact, I think, SDT does deal a lot with how environments either support or thwart people, but it also deals a lot with what are the factors of resilience and the internal resources that we have that we can use to be resilient in different situations. One of them, of course, is mindfulness. Another one that we're working on recently is integrative emotion regulation as a strategy. I think in general, we move in the direction of encouraging people to be conscious and aware of the determinants of their behavior so they can make real choices. So I think all those things that have to do with being able to observe and regulate your behavior so that you make choices that are the most meaningful given the alternatives that we have is really about the building of those inner resources. I do want to add here, I'm often suspicious of the concept of resilience, for instance, as an individual difference. It's pretty abstract in terms of just this issue of what are the factors that lead somebody to be resilient. And in addition, at least what I've seen in the research on resilience is that the people who later become resilient are the people who've had needs support earlier in their life. That's how they've built those inner resources to be able to be self-compassionate, self-empathic, mindful, more aware. That's because they've had opportunities to be supported in the past. So resilience itself doesn't come from nowhere. I'm particularly against certain kinds of resilient concepts like grit. Nothing bothers me more than to hear a concept like grit, because it seems to me to be a concept that says, you can overcome adversity if you just try harder or persevere. And to me, that's a blame the victim issue, which is it's trying to say, well, the people who don't make it here are the ones who don't have grit or don't have resilience. Sometimes we shouldn't have people in adverse situations in the first place. And if our children need to have grit, then we've got a problem with the institutions in which they're finding themselves. And equally so, I don't think we should be trying to find resilience as an individual difference, unless what we mean by that is we want to find the circumstances that help people build the inner resources that help them cope with the everyday things that we have to deal with. So I don't know if that speaks, Olaf, to your question, but...
Well, your question also reminds me of the work of Lisa Legault on assisted and asserted autonomy, where she focuses on those two aspects. And the more proactive side of it would be asserted autonomy, where you create the conditions indeed to get your need for autonomy met. In our own group, we have been doing some work, also intervention-related work around the notion of need crafting, with the idea implying on the one hand an awareness of indeed the circumstances that allow you to get your needs met. So there's like a knowledge awareness component to it, and then there is a more action-oriented component to it, where once you are more aware of what is indeed need fulfilling for yourself, you indeed are capable of making proactive choices in favor of getting your needs met. And so for the moment, the data seem to suggest indeed that those with a stronger capacity for need crafting do in fact are capable of getting their needs better met. And in intervention, we don't know the results yet, where we teach actually adolescents this capacity. So this kind of, relates to what you said, I think.
Stefan Uremia from Romania, and I have an outsider question. There are areas in my life that I don't care so much, like cooking. So I don't want to be autonomous. I don't want to be competent in that area. I don't want to relate really to anybody.
You just want to go to a restaurant.
Yeah, or my wife cook for me. So if all of a sudden my life changes and I have to cook, how SDT helps me with that?
With cooking?
That's
Ed knows. He is an excellent cook.
Well, so I don't know what traumas you suffered that have you feel that way in the kitchen, but I guess I'd want to explore those a little bit and see if we could overcome those. I don't think everybody has to be interested in everything, and I don't think SDT has ever said that one, in order to thrive, has to be, wanting to do everything. I'm not going to say anything about cooking here because Miriam's probably in the audience. So, but there are areas in my life, for instance, mechanical things in my house. I have no interest in those things. I don't want to fix them. I don't want to know how to fix them. I just want to be able to know the phone number of the person to call to fix them. But let's imagine that I didn't have the money or resources to call those people. What I would want to be able to do is find the resources and competence to carry that out myself, partly because I would have to, and then I would want to be able to feel the satisfaction that comes from that at the end. So even something that's not a strong interest, we can still, because it would be important and valuable to us to do, we still will move toward it, try and master it, try and internalize it to the best that we can. It sounds like cooking will at best ever be an interject in your life, and I totally understand that. But I wouldn't worry about that as long as your wife's still willing to cook for you.
Somebody else with a personal question, personal issue?
Hi, I'm Amy Jerem. I'm from the University of Rochester.
I'm sorry.
Well, I'm going to tell the story now that I took my very first psych class with Dr. Ryan, and it was not easy. He was pretty hard on me. but he was fairly supportive of my autonomy as well. Anyway, the question I have, and I talked to Dr. Deci about this very briefly this afternoon at the poster session, I have some concerns around fidelity to self-determination theory. So when I designed my doctoral project, I videotaped it and audio taped it, and I had all these different measures of how I could prove that my intervention was really self-determination theory. Like just saying it was self-determination theory wasn't enough. I have some concerns that there may be some instances of sort of hanging a self-determination theory shingle on a house that is not really need supportive. Do you have those same concerns, and what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, you raise a couple of questions here about, I guess the main one being fidelity, and does everybody who's measuring something like the concept of autonomy, are they measuring it appropriately? Or if they're measuring a basic psychological need, are they measuring it appropriately? Or if they're doing an intervention, they say they're supporting autonomy, are they truly doing it in accord with the theoretical tenets here? And I guess I would agree with you is that sometimes I get a little bit of shudder when I see something labeled as an SDT variable or conclusion, because sometimes they're not the ones that I would construct. But I am going to say the following thing, which is we have a big community of people, and I have a faith that these things work themselves out, that if somebody invents a measure that's not particularly, doesn't have the best fidelity, that somebody else will show its weaknesses over time. It may not happen immediately, but it will happen. There's been controversies within an SDT and between SDT and other theories at certain points, and I've thought, that we've been misportrayed in that. But we've gone to the work of getting the right portrayal out there and then showing the evidence for that right portrayal and then battling off the misportrayal of SDT. That's been painful sometimes. It's taken some time, but this is the strength of science. One thing about a scientific community like this is we have an epistemology that says there are criteria, there are things that we can appeal to know who's right and who's wrong when certain problems come up. So I worry about these things as you worry about these things, but I also believe we have a method, which is the scientific method, that works these things out over time, so that theory gets clarified and bad measures get weeded out, and that we keep improving these things. I want to say, while we're talking about this, we have some bad measures in this field. There are some measures that are really, really old now and keep getting reused, and they really need to be revised. And so I think it's the work of this community to revise them and get new ones out there. And I'm not just talking about the self-report measures. I'm talking about the observational measures, the developmental measures that we have, the neuropsychological assays that we do. On every front, we can always be improving measurement. And I think we always will be improving that. But we shouldn't be sanguine with the measures we've got, and we shouldn't reify the fact that something's been called autonomy in the past and say, well, now it's done. That's autonomy. The scales that have come out of Maarten's lab are not the final thing on this, right? They're going to be improved.
They are not.
So I think we need to always keep improving these things, and I think we should always worry, as you do, is this good enough?
I don't know whether Pedro Teixeira is in the audience, or Marta, or Heather. I think you're also involved in this broader project. Because it seems to be related to what is said here. So I don't know whether anybody of you guys wants to comment on the importance of...
There's
somebody here?
Yes.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. It's Maarten here. Yeah, we have been involved in a large piece of work on identifying SDT-based techniques. So we have developed a taxonomy with an expert consensus, and a lot of you in the room are also involved. And we have identified, it is on health-based contexts, but we are trying to list these techniques that target autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And this is just the first step to help reporting what you do in interventions. And we believe that if you start reporting the content of your interventions using these classifications or other classifications, for example, in educational contexts, then we'll be able to synthesize literature and we'll be able to identify which techniques were used. Of course, at this stage, we are also only looking at what are the techniques, not the quality or the fidelity, but we think that next steps could be starting to identify fidelity checks and the quality of the applications of these techniques and the extension and the way they are implemented as they should be by the theory.
Yeah.
Well, related to this, I think is one issue that came up in one of the workshops where they indeed also said that it would be important to share your full intervention descriptions and to make them available for others through the website. And I think that would be helpful for many of us to see indeed how others have been developing their interventions and indeed to examine their fidelity. So I think that's something we could work on as a group of researchers in the future.
And if I could just add, I think there's other things we can be doing to really increase our scientific rigor and our fidelity. And one of them, I think, is participating a lot more in the open science frameworks that are available now. And I want to talk about just briefly, I think it was Josh Howard. Is Josh here somewhere? Are you here? Anyway, he suggested that we create a repository for all of our data banks where we can put all of the things that come in for SDT so people could have ready access to this data so we could be doing more speedy meta-analyses and issues like that. So I just encourage everybody when you are collecting data to do the best you can to participate in open science frameworks. And I think for ourselves, we should just dedicate ourselves or commit ourselves to letting our data be open to everybody to take a look at so that other people can recheck and redo our work and see if they see the same things. Yes. So Shannon was just saying that CSDT is trying to work right now with Trevi Wen and others to create such a repository. So we'll have a place soon where you can put your data sets so that they'd be available to everybody.
Somebody else.
We have a question here.
Hi. So my name is Caitlin. I'm from the University of Rhode Island, and I have just been ruminating on the comment about the ecological crisis this whole time. Yeah. And it sounds like you guys are doing some important work on understanding materialism and what's driving us to consume in this way. But I just wanted to highlight a need that I really see for SDT. I'm actually housed in the College of Biological and Environment Science, and I'm seeing a lot of communication coming from my department that is not messages that the consumer wants to hear. And so we're constantly saying that the world is going to end, the oceans are boiling, what are we going to do about it? And that is not really giving the consumer choice, supporting their autonomy. We provide an explanation, but in a pretty threatening way. And so I think communicating with other colleagues, and I don't know if that's something that's being done on how do we teach scientists to talk to people, which I know we need to learn ourselves as well, but is that work being done, or does anyone have experience with that?
So just a couple of things on that. I think you've just pointed out another area of SDT research that I think has broad applicability, which is we do, as motivational scientists, we have some understanding about what kind of messages are readily internalized and which ones are rejected. And first I'll point to the work by Lisa Legault, where she did some work on prejudice and showed that certain kinds of messaging around prejudice, like don't be prejudiced or don't do this, actually backfire and increase prejudice, increase implicit prejudice in particular, whereas other kinds of messages that emphasize the choices in the information that we have tend to lead people to greater internalization. And I know that she's also done some work in the same area around ecological messaging, and particularly household energy use, and shown differential effectiveness of different kinds of messaging. So I think we could contribute a lot more into how can we get messages out there that people can readily internalize that will change behavior in the right direction, and we haven't done enough of that.
Here, Andy.
After that question.
So hi, I'm going to circle back around to fidelity and open science. Yeah. So it's kind of an interesting thing that you're right that SDT has always kind of had to be a well-defined and a well-operationalized kind of a fit set of theories as it arose out of some measure of conflict. And I'm curious what you both think about some of these theories coming under scrutiny and not finding support when people do open science. So there's a lot of relatively silly things like the facial feedback hypothesis, when everybody bothers to try to do the study properly and they write down what they're going to do ahead of time, none of it replicates. Yeah. That's pretty distal from SDT, but things like terror management theory actually don't work. Implicit and explicit processes, they don't predict behavior in the way that the original studies in JPSB would have had us think. And so I'm just curious, I'd like to know what your reflection is about what this means for theory. What does the reproducibility crisis and this move towards open science, what kind of opportunities do you think it provides SDT in terms of theory development and theory testing?
So probably, I hope everybody in the room knows the context that Andy's question comes from, which there has been a so-called crisis in psychology about replicability, and many things that we thought were sure findings in the field don't turn out not to be replicable when people carefully study these things in multiple laboratories. And one of the things about SDT, and I think Ed and I agreed on this from the beginning, which is SDT has developed pretty slowly. We just wrote a chapter that was called Brick by Brick that is in some book about how it's built itself very slowly with the following admonition that we agreed upon when we first decided that we would do a theory together or to help start a theory together, which is don't make errors of commission. So there are things that you might not cover, you might not know something, but don't go out and say something until you've got solid evidence behind the proposition that you have. So our 6 mini-theories have been built very, very slowly, and the tenets that are in them are things that I think we can stand behind because they've been demonstrated in multiple ways through convergent methods in multiple times before we've come to the place of saying, oh yeah, now this is going to be a tenet within our theory. I think another thing that helps us, Andy, in self-determination theory to not be having winging findings that then can't get replicated is it's hard to have a hypothesis within SDT that's not already itself kind of building off the existing theory that's already been well substantiated and well supported. When you have a very tight theory that dictates what kind of hypothesis you can have, then you're not likely, if an anomalous finding comes out, you've got a problem rather than a strength. So in a way, we're not looking to find some new wild anomalous finding. We're often trying to re-show once again the truth of the things we know to be really true. And so I think we haven't faced the same issues with the replicability crisis that other people have had because most of our data is redundantly validated over and over and over again. It's been validated in different ways. And so I think when we build theory slowly and carefully and as a community in which we do, and I think the more we make our methods and our data open so people can constantly be playing with it and checking on it, we're in a better position, a stronger position to move ahead. So I really like the open science movement. I think it's a needed adjustment for a field which is mostly interested in sound bites and quick findings that will make people get some short-term fame for them. That's not what SDT is about, and I think I'm really glad we're not about that. We're about building a framework that you can use, you can practice from when we make prescriptions. It's something that you can reliably depend upon. I think this is what makes this a valuable framework. I just hope we continue in that careful way, and not add new ideas to this theory unless they're redundantly proven.
The first set of studies that I did that relate to what we're all interested in here were the Undermining Studies that pay people for doing interesting things and they don't find it interesting anymore. And I remember there were a set of them and they were published in JPSP, and I remember that when I opened the journal and saw it, I looked at it and I thought, oh, please, somebody replicate this. Because it was so going against the mainstream of what psychology was doing at that time. But now, 50 years later, I'm pretty confident that it does replicate.
Well, one thought I also have here is on the moment it does not work, I think it's important to further explore it. So what are the conditions under which it does not work? And even a non-significant finding is, I think, very interesting by itself and would require an explanation. And one example of this is we have been trying to develop an implicit measure of competence need satisfaction. And so Julien van der Kaap she did like a series of 4 studies, and it turned out to be non-effective. It didn't predict anything above and beyond explicit competence satisfaction. And so, but I think in doing this, we pursued it to the very end, trying different methods to get at the implicit measure. And now I'm more confident that in a way it does not work, which is just for competence. So maybe the other needs, there's more work to be done. But I think we should not be anxious to also present non-significant findings and give meaningful explanations for them so we can be transparent about this.
Yeah.
Hello, Rebecca Champ. I'm coming from the UK, although I don't sound like I'm from there. I wanted to, first of all, thank both of you. This is my first conference, and it's been an amazing experience, and I appreciate your openness and friendliness and tolerance with a little bit of fangirl behavior. So thank you very much. I have ADHD, and I'm a psychotherapist and coach, and the master's work that I did was of a very practical nature originally. So I was looking to build a treatment program. And in the process of that work, I discovered that there is a theoretical problem in working with ADHD, in that the perception of ADHD and the treatment is all focused from a cognitive behavioral perspective. And that when you look at ADHD from a self-determination theory perspective, it completely changes how you can potentially approach and design treatments and consider origins of the behavior and ask questions. But I'm also very aware that this is a very dominated field by one theory. And I know that I am taking on a lion here. And so I wondered if you had any recommendations for beginning that work, how I can reach out to the community, how you deal with a treatment or a focus that doesn't, is very challenging to other perspectives that may in fact have longitudinal effect that is positive.
Yeah. Well, first I want to sympathize with the circumstance that you see in children who have ADHD or people who have ADHD, because typically the treatment for ADHD has been behaviorally oriented and has been controlling in its very nature. And then the result of that is that even when it works, it's not working because it's not helping those children thrive in other ways, and it's hurting them in other aspects of their lives. And part of the reason that this even occurs is because it's occurring within an ecology of schools, which has a very narrow band of behaviors that it's going to allow or be able to accommodate. And so, there's an ecology here that leads to a controlling technique that gets applied across the board that we may think is not the optimal technique to help these children or adults with the same disorder thrive. So it is a big battle. There's a big battle out there all the time. We've been battling behaviorism really since the very beginning because behavioral techniques appear to work in some short-term ways. They appear to work with ADHD kids in some ways. And then it's the long-term consequences of it that we see that's really the problematic issue. The maintenance and transfer, and also the self-esteem and psychological effects of the long-term exposure to those treatments are really problematic. What's the best way to battle this? Information, better therapies, better outcomes. Again, to battle it with the science that we have. I think our science can win this battle. It has already won many battles against behaviorism in this way. It will continue to win those battles. And when I say that, it'll also point out the places where behaviorism has some validity and some utility. It's just a much narrower band of the world than behaviorists originally thought. And the band of the world that really has to do with helping people get motivated through other means, I think is a much more important one. So when we get to ADHD kids, we've done some work in this area. One of the things that I think has really been shown is that ADHD kids, because they get treated with such behavioral control, have an autonomy thwarting experience in most of their lives. And then there are compensatory and acting out and defiant issues that then are arising just because of that itself. This is one of the reasons why we need better treatments, so we don't put them through this process and those needs. So I just applaud your work, and I'm glad you're creating new programs based in SDT.
In the back there.
Yes, but also, I want to go back a step to talking about novel things occurring in SDT and talking about replication and that sort of thing. So one of the things I observed more in this conference than I have before, perhaps because our own recent data shows it, is finding that introjection splits into two factors, and I've heard lots of people talk about that, and I mentioned that to you earlier, Rich. I'm wondering if you can comment on that. Should we be delving into that more? And are there any other kinds of phenomena like that where you see that there might be, people might be finding these kinds of things in different labs that either require more exploration or maybe somebody's already resolved that? And yeah, so that's my question.
Well, so the particular phenomena that you're referring to is that recently, when some people have been modeling the taxonomy of human motivation that goes from external regulation up through integrated and intrinsic motivation, sometimes you can take the interjected items and you can divide them into two types of items. One is I would call it the avoidance side of interjection, which is you're avoiding guilt and anxiety or shame, and that's what's driving you to do something, versus you're trying to do something that will make you look better, have better status, or have higher esteem in some way, which is the more prideful aspect of interjection that has a different set of predictors as its outcomes. And I think I relayed to you the story. When we originally created the simplex, it was actually 7 levels. It started with avoiding punishment as an external regulation, and then the next level up was getting rewards or seeking rewards. Then the next level up was avoiding guilt and anxiety, and the next level up was attaining pride and self-aggrandizement. And then the next level up was not failing at something that you valued, and the next level up was attaining something that you identified with or valued. And then there was intrinsic motivation. So that was 7 levels. And that was pretty reliable. We could do that at any given time. We can divide it up. But the thing I want to say about interjection and having its two sides, which is I believe we can, in structural equation and measurement models, we can take those things and we can parse them, and it's going to be pretty clear that the approach side is going to predict more positive things and the avoidance side is going to predict more negative things. But I wouldn't want people to forget the fact that if you have an interject, you have both sides of it. In other words, you don't have just the side that's the approach side of interject. If you have the approach side, you also have the avoidance side inside you. And even though we can parse those things statistically, they coexist in the human psyche. And the same is true around other things that we can divide up into, we can parse in structural equation modeling that won't parse at the level of an individual who will have both sides. So if you're a successful interjected person and you've gone around the world and you've succeeded at almost everything and you've got a big inflated pride as a result and you feel as big as Cleveland, that's great for you, but you're still vulnerable to the day that doesn't happen. You're still vulnerable to what happens when things aren't working out that way, and that's going to be. And then you're still also under the stress to constantly keep proving that. So those dark sides are in there, even if they're not showing up in the parsed measurement of the other side. So I just would want to be careful that we don't forget about that there's a phenomenological reality to all of these things that we measure. It's not just how we can parse variances when we put together models, but it's also what does that really mean in the real world when we're thinking about people and the psyches and how people's psyches operate. So
I also think...
I just want to say...
Go ahead.
Well, just one more thing about interjection. People often say to me, I used the interjection measure and it correlated 0 with outcomes. I think exactly. It's unreliably related to outcomes. Sometimes interjection will get you your outcome. Sometimes it will not get you your outcome. That 0 prediction is a prediction. It's what you would expect if you think it's an unreliable predictor of outcomes, whereas some other things we think are reliably negative and some other things we think are reliably positive predictors. So it's not a surprise to me when we get that kind of result. That's what we should expect.
And also, I think the costs of interjection might not only manifest in a certain domain, like at work, but outside that domain, like in terms of work-family interference, or your rumination before you fall asleep. You start all of the interjects you have around work that come up, that surface, and on that moment that interfere with sleep. So I think some of the costs of interjection just not have been studied enough. And so sometimes we just then focus on let's say, the null relations, which is taken to be against the theory, but indeed, as Rich says, I think that the ordered pattern of correlates, that's what we would expect.
That's what we'd expect.
And so interjections should be somewhere in between there.
Let me just say another thing, because I think structural equation modeling fools us a lot. Because in structural equation modeling, you parse variances and then you predict different outcomes with those parsed variances, but those things are not real variables in the world. I'll just give an example of that. A lot of times people are looking at, say, performance goals, and they say, well, they're performance avoidance goals and performance approach goals, and they predict very different outcomes. They happen to be correlated 0.6 or 0.65, meaning they're almost always co-occurring. So we have to think about this co-occurrence as an important part of understanding even how to interpret our data.
But I think that's also why the profile analysis we have seen here on the conference kind of speak to this issue where you just not focus on the dimension but on an individual, which is likely combining different forms of interjection, either in combination with external forms of regulation or more autonomous ones. So I think that may have more ecological validity and speaks more to the dynamic, I think, of interjection itself.
Hello, my name is Louise and I'm from Denmark. Thank you for having... I'm here. Okay. Yeah, thank you for having formulated one of the most important theories in the world. I would very much like to hear your thoughts about two possible additions in how teachers can support their students' needs for autonomy and competence. And perhaps I have overlooked them. Perhaps you have already formulated them, and then I apologize. But so one thing about autonomy, and that is the teacher's own engagement. So that when the students see how much the teacher enjoys something, they are much more willing to choose to say yes and engage for themselves in that activity. In fact,
there's actually research that shows exactly that.
Yeah.
Brian Patrick, in his dissertation, showed exactly what you just said.
Okay, so it is one of the, but is it also a part of the questionnaires when we investigate the students' sense of autonomy in the classroom?
Yeah, so I think what Brian Patrick showed in his dissertation was that teacher enthusiasm was one of the biggest predictors of students' intrinsic motivation in the classroom. And then but what wasn't explained in there, I think, is what your further question is why is that? What is it about teacher enthusiasm that leads then students to be either more intrinsically motivated or more internalized? And I would just say the following thing. I don't know this yet because I don't think it's been shown. But my guess is that when a teacher's enthusiastic, they're also demonstrating that they personally value this material. They're showing that it's worthwhile. They're showing that it has interest value. It's close to what Avi Asar might call an intrinsic value demonstration. It's actually showing that this other adult who you may have some attachment to actually cares about this thing.
Yes.
And so I think that helps internalization in that sense. And it's certainly, when somebody else is excited about something, it certainly piques our interest as maybe there's something exciting there to check out. Yeah. So I think in both those ways, it probably leads, teacher enthusiasm is a big variable to support student engagement, in part because of what it's conveying in terms of those values.
And then about competence, that is the possibility for the students to be physical active in the classroom, to work active and with the content, because then it's possible for them to concentrate about the content and thereby feel competent. So the value of physical activity and brain breaks and energizers and just be able to walk around in the classroom related to competence.
Because you bring it up in this way, I want to go to a larger question, which is if we look around the world of schools today, across the world, they're operating by a paradigm that's been around for now 80 or 90 years with no justification at all. Okay, we have no justification for why we put people sitting still for hours at a time, especially at that age range. We have no justification for the thing that we call grading. Grading is not a motivational device. It's never been shown to be effective as a motivational device. It's not even effective in the ways that people think it's effective in schools.
School is a non-scientific experiment.
It's a non-scientific. We segregate kids into ages in strict small groups by ages. Who thought that was a good idea? So we have a bunch of really unproven, unvalidated practices that are the central practices in education. And every day we're trying to get kids to internalize the need to follow rules and principles that themselves have no good rationale. And so I know this isn't an answer to your question, it's just a bigger problem that I'm raising here. But if SDT has anything to do, it's being critical of the social institutions in which we reside. And one of the things SDT does is it takes any social institution, any practice, and says, how good is it at satisfying people's basic psychological needs? And schools have a lot to look at in this respect. We have a lot to criticize. And it includes the fact that we're so physically constraining of kids at a developmental age when they need to be exploring, playing, learning, doing, because that's how their brain would most optimally develop. Instead, we're putting them passive, sitting, listening, and following orders. That's not the way that the brain naturally develops. So it's these kinds of issues that we should be really critical of. We should be criticizing our social institutions for doing these kinds of things that are both need-depriving and ineffective at even the goals that schools themselves have. And if I could take one further, standardized testing, standardized high-stakes testing is hurting our children across the world, because what it does is creates an artificial competition toward an outcome that itself has no validity, but corrupts classroom practice everywhere that people care about it. We have to criticize these things because we have evidence that shows that this is a corrupting practice. All outcome-focused rewards tend to have this corrupting influence. And so I just want to say there's so much we can criticize about the way we treat our children, the way we try and raise them, and SDT has a way of criticizing it because we actually have criteria for what these institutions should be doing and what should be met, and I think we should keep applying them. So,
Stephen Brewer from France. Hey, I wanted to just ask a question about, because I've been ruminating.
Is it about schools?
Yes, it is.
Oh.
It's about schools, and it's about what you said earlier, Rich, about grit, and because I was kind of seduced by Angela Duckworth's book, but now you're making me think about it. And I'm just wondering, though, in SDT terms, there are kinds of learning that I would kind of associate with transcendence and very particular kinds or genres of constraints that are, volition's kind of in there. I don't like what SDT, because I know I've seen quite a few slides here about kind of there's engagement and it leads to the outcomes that we want. And I'm kind of interested in that link where the engagement doesn't necessarily lead to the outcomes that we want, and we really have to work on the way we're going about learning. Also kind of maybe unlearning ways that we've learned to learn, if that makes any sense, in order to do better. In other words, and I'm just thinking, that grit is sometimes, I've always seen it as kind of a positive thing, but is there a way that SDT is another construct that's kind of more in, I don't know, I guess you could say it's coherent with SDT values?
So if we just go back to grit for a minute, Stephen, it's made up of two components. One is the thing we've known all along in the Big Five as conscientiousness. So it contains an element. And the other is this perseverance against adversity. So this is where I come down to, first of all, why do we have to persevere against adversity? We should call into question the adversity. That's the first thing. But even if we do, if there are circumstances that are difficult, what SDT suggests is that if you're going to need to persevere against something that's a difficult obstacle, you're going to need a good rationale for doing it, and you're going to need certain kinds of needs supports in order to make that through. So we should, instead of trying to put it on grit, we should be providing those needs supports and those rationales and the things that will help people internalize the motivation that will be required to overcome those obstacles. And we have a model for that. I mean, that is our internalization model. Because I know you love this area yourself, which is the area of music and music performance. Paul Evans presented some evidence here that's, I think, really interesting evidence about elite musicians. They have to practice, 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 and practice. And a lot of it's the mundane aspects of music over and over, doing scales over and over and over again. But what gets a person to do that is not just grit, it's understanding the value of those scales.
Yes.
And it's also inventing music like etudes that allow you to do scales with a little bit of fun in them. In other words, help people find ways to do that that's actually going to be both beneficial and has a little intrinsic motivation into it. That's part of what I think curriculum design is about. So I think, again, I just want to get back to, let's not think about grit, let's think about better design of our curriculum and better socialization into the things that people need to do to persevere.
And I think also with respect to the issue of grit, but also self-control, in some ways, I think the measurement itself is often conflated with the outcome. And so perseverance is one aspect of grit, and then they predict with grit that children are persevering. So I'm not surprised. And then a lot of attention is given to the notion of grit, but in fact the findings are tautological. So.
Yeah. Well, they're not only tautological. I don't know if you've seen the recent findings on this, but they also don't work. So grit interventions in schools, the recent meta-analysis show they don't work, and the same is true, by the way, with some of the new meta-analysis on mindset. These things are not effective, at least as we know, but they came out with heavy sound bites. And one of the reasons I want to suggest that grit came out with such a popular set of sound bites is it really appeals to politicians, because they would rather blame poor children for the performance in school than blame schools for not providing what poor children need. And so, but Stephen, you didn't really ask any of that. That was not here.
Rich, you need to stick to the question.
Hi, I'm Carmen. I'm from Spain. And I kind of wanted to follow up on the idea about being critical about schools, because what I find is that even though nobody actually provided what you said about why schools are the way they are, it's very internalized in students in themselves. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Muppet Babies, but there's an episode when one of the characters says, they're playing Simon Says, and one of them says, Simon Says, act like a pizza. And they all stare at each other like, how do you do that? And when you give students, well, at least I'm a student myself, so when a teacher tells us or tries to be a little bit more implement self-determination theory, we all just stare at each other like, how are we supposed to be self-motivated? And it's really intertwined in our mindset. And basically my question is, I think, how do we change that on a bigger scale?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm just going to begin to answer this with a story that I want to tell you a bit. I was on the board of a school in Rochester that was called the School Without Walls. It was a very progressive high school that was very much gives responsibility to students to dictate and run their own curriculum and find their way there. But most of the kids who came to the school came from very authoritarian schools that were in the district, and then they transferred over to the school. And as soon as they would get to the school and they would realize, oh, there's a lot of flexibility in the rules here, and oh, you don't even have to go to class, they would just not go to class. And they would just fall behind because they were used to a system that was controlling them. And then as soon as they were freed from the control, they had not internalized any sense of responsibility or any sense of what to do with it. So they just wanted to break the system as much as they could do it. So part of this is the holdover from the conditioning you get when you're in a controlling system, and then when somebody takes away those controls, you don't know what to do with that. So at least in our interventions there, what we did is we created a system where when people transferred into the school, they had high structure. So somebody met with them every week to go over what's going on with you this week, and we see that you went here or didn't go there. Tell us about that, so that they had to be at least accountable to an adult in the school. And as they showed that they were able to handle the responsibility and structure of the school, then they were released from those meetings at the frequency of those meetings. But it was in part that they needed to internalize the things that were important within that setting, and they needed guidance and adult support in order to do that. So I think you can't just take a controlling system, get rid of the controlling system, and then people adapt to it. They don't. Our kids will break out into partying as soon as they can because they're in such controlled circumstances so much of the time. So I think it takes scaffolding. I think it takes structure. And I think if SDT in education has any strong messages, that the best educational environments are characterized by two things: high autonomy support and high structure. It's those two things together that make for a good, I think, classroom setting and school setting. And so we can't forget about the structure when we're thinking about needs support, because that's how people can also experience a sense of accomplishment and competence as well.
Hi, I'm Crystal from the Netherlands. I also want to go on this topic of criticizing the schooling system. I just have a question. I saw the whole week a lot of talks, presentations that are all about the autonomy support in schools or school settings. And in fact, I have my question. If we want to change something, is the results, how they are presented, isn't that enforcing the way that we actually work? So it shows it works this way, and if we do a little bit more autonomy support in schools, the children will thrive better, and it goes better, and that's fine, that's great. But still, there is not really a critical message in these results that, well, if we could give children perhaps more choices or do things differently, it would maybe be even better for them. So my question is, isn't it also valid for the researchers to be a little bit more critical on the environments that they actually do the research in?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes, as long as what our criticism comes from is an evidence base. In other words, it can't just be armchair criticism. It's got to be that you have an evidence base, or at least a logical base out of the theory for doing that criticism. So I think that's an important thing. You know, just related to what you just said, one of the things that I think came out in a number of talks that I saw this week, and I know is in the literature, is that if you want teachers to be able to support students' autonomy, you need to give teachers support for autonomy. So if we want to change school systems, that's one of the directions we need to go, is to help the teaching profession come back to its professional roots. Oh. Teachers are professionals, and right now they're being micromanaged by politicians who are not educators at all, to accomplish aims that are not educators' aims at all. So I think, you know, one of the biggest battles ahead is for the professionalization of teachers, and that means returning to them the autonomy over their own classrooms so they can create an atmosphere of interest and responsiveness and relevance to the students who they're trying to engage in their classrooms. That's a place I think we could have a bigger voice.
I agree, and I think I would like to give this example from Belgium, where we actually in primary school, they have been revisiting the curriculum. And so the basis for it, before they talked about what they called culture-bounded developmental lines. And now they have been adding what is called more personal developmental issues. And so the terms autonomy, relatedness, and competence figure actually in the curriculum now. And it's something they needed to be taken into account as a primary school teacher in preparing classes, is both what you teach, but also the how component. And so it's very central that kind of supporting the personal development of the children is important. So my feeling is that by also giving these community talks and going out in your country, you can actually have an impact on what's going on. And I think in Flanders, that's by far, I think, the biggest impact we have had there, because every single teacher now in primary school is actually thinking about it from an SDT lens now, although it's not framed that way. So, but I think that's a level where sometimes we have been developing also interventions where we train teachers to do it differently, but maybe it needs to be a more structural change at a higher level. And as a group, we can, I think we can influence this. And the more people actually try to impact the policy, the bigger the change will be over time.
Hi, Rafael from Peru. And I'm very curious, you just mentioned mindset, and I'm very curious to know your opinion about mindset, because it's getting more and more popular, and I want to know what you think about it. And I like to cook.
Well, you know, mindset is not self-determination theory, so I don't have anything to say about it. No. Well, I mean, if you look at mindset, I think one of the reasons we see it has great appeal is it's a pretty easy concept to understand. There's one on this one's good, this one's bad. and we can contrast them one another. So it's kind of easy to grasp. It seems like, oh, just have a growth mindset that will solve everything. But if you think about what is entailed in a growth mindset, that's basically self-efficacy. So it's the idea that I can do something and I can make progress in this area, as opposed to I can't. So we've known a lot about self-efficacy. We've known a lot about perceived competence for a while. The thing we also know in self-determination theory is competence alone won't get you there. That it also needs to be autonomous competence. So just trying to convince people that they can do it isn't really enough to have them do it in a high-quality way. So I think one of the reasons that we see that these interventions fail is that they are missing the other part of what it takes to have sustained and high-quality motivation over time, and that's support for autonomy. And that's not in the mindset conceptualization in any direct way. But I don't want to go on a lot about mindset. It has its own problems, and I don't want to solve them. Because
he has already enough problems to be solved by
exactly.
himself.
We have enough within SDT to solve. But it also doesn't have a good developmental theory under. Well, never mind. I'm not going to go on.
So I want to circle back to I'm over here. I'm Don from Oregon in the USA. I want to circle back when you described your way of working with these kids who came out of a controlling structure, and then you provided structure. And I think that one of the things that I think is really important, actually, Maarten, I think, alluded to it, is that what you did was not, and then you emphasized that you provide autonomy and structure. Yeah. But I want to note that what you described was providing structure graded to their ability to self-structure. Yeah. And to notice that there's different multiple levels of structure operating in the same moment, is that you were able to provide that because within that context you were giving your teachers, the people facilitating this environment, that level of support. Yeah. And so that's to me, a really important point. Yeah. To recognize, and that I think that there should be, or I hope there's a way that the researchers here can better articulate the interaction between those levels, as to we look at teachers and students. Can we also, and I actually think there's a poster on principals as well. How do we support that? And then what would it mean to support administrators? I don't know that anybody's doing that. What would it mean for the human system to be described at all of its levels in a system that is as complex as schooling? So just a comment for that.
I agree.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Yes. My name is Chi from the Netherlands, and I want to break the chain of education, questions about education. I want to circle back to introjection and outcome. I read a paper, 2005, I guess, with Rolnick, and was about motivational interviewing in SDT. And in 2014, they wrote another paper, Meet Us in the Middle, what can theory learn what we don't know from empirical studies? And I had a problem with that. I have a beef with motivational interviewing in general because of introjection and outcome. And I want to put that thought out there. Because if you kind of measure on change talk and action, anybody who's introjected, regulated, will pass the test for motivational interviewing. And I was kind of confirmed by a recent paper on autonomy interventions. There were 19 interventions. Motivational interviewing was one of them. And from the 19, only 2 actually increased autonomy. And motivational interviewing was not one of them. And that kind of confirmed my thought on it. But I'm interested in your thoughts on my...
Well, first, I want to see that particular systematic review that you're talking about, because I've seen other ones that...
got it from your Twitter feed, I get.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, if it's the one I'm thinking of, I actually would read it differently, but we can talk about that afterwards. But I first want to resonate with some of your concerns about motivational interviewing, because they were the concerns that we've been articulating all along. So that first paper you alluded to that Rolnick wrote, I mean, I was a co-author on that paper, and part of our point was motivational interviewing could use a theory underlying it. And part of my thinking in that was it could use self-determination theory in particular, so it could avoid some of the traps that are easy to enter into when you use motivational interviewing. So motivational interviewing, for those of you who don't know a lot about it, is a technique that was invented by Miller and Rolnick. It was originally applied in addiction disorders, and it really came out of what I would call their Rogerian framework, or client-centered framework. And so the original idea in motivational interviewing was to really inquire with a person, for instance, who had issues with alcohol, into their motivation for change, and to try and find out, from them, what was the things that would lead them to be wanting to change, and what were the things that might be in the way of change, so that they could come to a set of choices and decisions about what to do. To me, the original intent of motivational interviewing was never to get people to do a certain thing, but it was rather to help them come to a real choice about what to do. But motivational interviewing then, as it developed, has really good techniques, I think, to help people get motivated. And so then people thought, oh, let's add that on as a motivational enhancement technique for treatments that we already know the direction of. So if I have a smoking cessation program and I have smokers, motivational interview them first so that they get motivated now, and now we'll change them smoking. Well, if you have that attitude, then you are already misusing motivational interviewing. You're already not doing it in a way that supports autonomy. And I fear that motivational interviewing has gone down a bit of the wrong track by switching over to the notion of change talk. So instead of having the original aim of motivational interviewing to come to the patient's own or client's own autonomous decision making, instead now it's let's get them to talk about change so that they'll make the change. And change talk could indeed be interjected, just as you say.
Yeah.
So I think this is a misdirection within motivational interviewing, and I think it's a wrong direction for them, because if you want sustained change, it's got to come from an autonomously motivated place, and that's what the technique was originally intended to do, and can do what the techniques can be used to do that, but they can also be used to manipulate people. Something like amplified discrepancy. If you're trying to manipulate people, you're always looking at one side of that amplification of discrepancy. But if you're truly doing motivational interviewing, you're interested in both sides of that discrepancy equally.
Actually, adding to what you were saying, at some point I was at a conference in Brussels where Rolnick was giving a talk, and so he showed a video of a person who expressed change talk, and what he said is, I should quit smoking. And so I raised my hand after the video and I asked, okay, would you consider that as an adaptive form of change talk? It seems like a more controlled form of self-talk. And he said, okay, there's a certain guy, Vansteenkiste, who says that. I happened to be the guy who was asking the question. He didn't know that. And so I fully agree. I think change talk is just a manifestation of an underlying process of need satisfaction. If it occurs smoothly, I think there will be autonomous change talk being expressed, and other moments more controlled forms of change talk. Also, another thing I think about MI is, to what extent is there actually a possibility for not making a change out of autonomous reasons? Right. Is that an option on the table there? Because I think from an SDT perspective, if the person comes to the decision after reflection to not make a change, well, maybe that's a meaningful outcome by itself. And of course, if you're just going to evaluate our therapeutic techniques based on the results, the number of people that make a change, well, really, I think you're missing there these people who would be considered dropouts, but I think they have good reasons not to start or to disengage from change altogether. And so that means we need to open up the way how we think about what is an effective therapy. It's not just about the result of making change, but also the more autonomous underlying reasons either to change or not change whatsoever. And so I think on that point, we make it, that's different from MI.
There's a guy named Vansteenkiste who's written a paper on that.
Yeah. I think. Not interested.
Well,
Still 3 minutes. So maybe one of the last questions here, and then I still have, let's say, something for the whole audience with the future, a question regarding the future of SDT.
Okay.
Good. I will try to turn it a bit. I'm from the industry. I'm out there every day and doing changes in rather big organizations. And when I listen to you, good people here during this week, sometimes I get this feeling that you could just have called me and I told you it's the way it is. It's the way people behave in big organizations. You don't need to do 3 years of study. I get this feeling of detachment between what is happening in the real world and among this community here of SDT. And I'm looking very much for knowledge, right? Because I truly believe in it. The theory is super good. I'm just doing a lot, but I don't know why it works, right? And I now discovered that you up there during the moderation that you are one of the rock stars. I went to you yesterday's and asked you if to get in touch. I don't know if you remember, and your answer, I hope it's okay that I refer to it, was yeah you can Google me. And find my address there, and maybe that's a very good picture of this feeling of yes, you can criticize the schools, but if you have the knowledge, you have the obligation to act, not do papers, right? And I mean, this act, that's one of the very important sentences in the organization I am in. If you have the knowledge, you have the obligation to act. It's not enough just to criticize. It's just my it's not, yeah. And I would like you to hear out because I have a hard time, getting in contact and finding these good scientists that would like to help me, it's kind of conflict because you know a lot. It's super good. Let us know what is super good, right?
Well, I was mainly going to say that Maarten Vansteenkiste should have helped you out when you asked him for this. No.
Sorry, but I don't have the time to Google people. That's not in my scope of work, right? I'm out there to help, right?
Understood. So a couple of things that I want to say about your thing. First of all, you are at a conference here where there's a lot of research going on, and that is part of what we do. We're trying to create an evidence base and a knowledge base so that people can have plans for action that can be reliably acted upon. I don't think that that's divorced from action. I think many of the people in the room who are also researchers also are actors. I, for instance, and I'm just going to use myself as an example, I've been campaigning for 20 years in the public domain against high-stakes testing. I've done dog and pony shows around the country. I've sat in the offices of politicians trying to lobby with them against high-stakes testing, trying to use the knowledge that's come from SDT to stop that particular thing. Have I been successful? The answer to that is a little. A little, because in New York State right now, they've been backing way off from the testing that's gone on in New York State, and part of that's because parents have been reached and parents have started to opt their kids out of the testing, and that's why the state has now had this crumbling system, because people are aware of the fact that there's no validity and there's nothing there, but it's taken 20 years to make that change. These things are not easy. We step into organizations every day and we try and, at least my company, Immersive, every day is stepping into organizations trying to create more autonomy, supportive management styles within those organizations, I think in really constructive ways. Some organizations resist this pretty strongly. Some other ones take it up as part of their new culture. I think we learn a lot when we act in the world that helps us back in research. And I would add to this, I'm also a clinician, so one of the things I've learned over the years is my clients have taught me as much about self-determination theory as has the number of studies that I've done out there. Acting in the world and doing interventions is a way that we learn. Interventions are a huge part of our evidence base, the things that work and don't work within them. So, I applaud the idea of moving to action. I just want to say when we do act, let's collect information on it so we don't just have anecdotes, but we actually know, what's worked and what hasn't worked. And I think that's been a big part of why we have really strong research built around the interventions we do so we can identify what components are effective and not effective. But I'd finally want to say that one thing that I hope SDT has done is it's also had an impact on the culture that's way beyond even what we do, the people in this room. That some of the language, some of the wording, some of the things has started to invade ways of thinking. We see it in popular books that are out there that are not our own books. We see it in the fact that schools do question, for instance, the use of rewards or gold stars, where they never used to question those things. And that some people do see some of the problems with outcome-focused rewards and high-stakes bonuses for CEOs, for instance, partly based on a knowledge base that we're giving here. So, I think one of the values of having a strong theory with a strong evidence base that has an intervention arm to it, that also has people who are writing about it and picking it up in the news, is that it's operating on multiple fronts. And you can't judge it by just one set of activities because there's a whole array of activities that are growing out of the body of work that's here at SDT. And I was happy to see a lot of practical programs that were here both in posters and in other areas. I actually, was a little disappointed to see not as much basic science here as I would have wanted to see. I really like that too. We need all of these things, and we're obviously not acting fast enough or well enough to make the world the place that we'd really want it to be. And I can only resonate with that belief.
Sorry, I'm waiting.
Thank you.
I'm waiting for a question here. Sorry, Maarten. Well, I'm Ekaterini Mihu from Turkey, and I would like to bring you back to a conceptual issue. You talked about unidimensionality in introjection and maybe in performance goals. And I'm wondering if need satisfaction and frustration is a unidimensional concept as well, because we read recently that not having our needs satisfied doesn't mean that our needs are frustrated. And I'm wondering, is this true?
Well, the empirical work that has come out really has to do with the fact that we used to measure need satisfaction along a dimension that went from high satisfaction to the absence of that satisfaction. And I think in some of the work, particularly the work that was done by Kimberly Bartholomew and Nikos Doumanis and others, really brought out the fact that if we also look further, not just at the dimension that goes from satisfaction to the absence of satisfaction, but we go further to look at also the thwarting and frustration of needs, that we pick up a lot more variance, and we particularly can predict more variance on the side of ill-being. And so that's why this has expanded. I want to go further too, which is I think we've seen in some spheres when we're measuring on the moment-to-moment basis or across time, that we can see that the same person can be both autonomy supportive and controlling across their interactions with people, and that the same person can have some moments of need satisfaction as well as need frustration. So I think by measuring these things separately, we have a more differentiated model of the world. We can see some of the more damaging things now that are done under the guise of need thwarting and why they have the negative impact they have. So I think it's useful that we've expanded the dimension away from just satisfaction to its absence to satisfaction all the way to frustration. And how much differentiation we measure in the middle of that, how useful that will be, that's an empirical question, and I think that will come out in the studies that are emerging now.
Thank you. So I think it's about time to finish this session, rather unfortunately, and it also means that's the end of the conference, but not before saying the following two things. I think Shannon has been putting a lot of effort in creating a new website, taking initiative. Indeed, also a lot of people are involved in it, and we are trying to reach out to the community, and I think it also speaks maybe to your question. So if there is any material available from that where we have shown it is effective material that is relevant for practitioners, our idea is also to bring it on the site there to show what the impact has been. And so a number of people in this audience all have been given the responsibility or asked to add to maintaining one page one domain on the website. And so in this respect, I think it becomes more a shared endeavor. It's something of all of us. And in that respect, our question is also if there is any group who is interested and willing to organize the next SDT conference. I remember Rashmi came to us shortly after the conference 2 years ago in Victoria, and she was very committed to take up that role. Started already organizing things 2 years ago.
How do you feel about that now, Rashmi?
Great. I feel great.
You should feel great. Yeah.
And I think it's also her team, of course, everybody else who was involved. And so if anybody is actually willing to make that time investment, it would be very useful for us to know, so we can see indeed where we will be going to in 3 years from now. There are no decisions made. It's not a test you need to pass or anything. It's just like, okay, let's see what comes out from this community. So that's what I still wanted to say. I don't know about the two of you guys.
Any concluding comment?
I am so happy to be here with all of you people. I mean, it's just been an incredible 5 or 6 days for me to be talking to so many of you. There's some that I didn't get a chance to, and I'm sorry about that. But, and hearing talks and reading posters that have such good work in them, it's just really been wonderful. So I thank you all very much.
I guess my last comment has to do with what you mentioned about the future of SDT, which is, of course, it's my hope that SDT does have a future. I think that future will be one that, at some point soon doesn't include the two of us. And I think it's important to us that it's not our theory. It was our theory at one time because nobody else was doing it at all. There were only two of us at one time. But, it's grown into be a community effort. And just the way Maarten is talking about it here, it's something that will only be sustained and grow because it's owned by this community. And in some ways, I think we will be hopefully disappearing from this scene, and others of you in this audience are going to be the leaders. You're going to be inventing those next mini theories. You're going to be correcting the mistakes that we made, and I look forward to that. I hope to watch that from a distance while I'm retired. Thank you very much.